Welcome back to my YouTube channel. In last week's instalment, I went through the thinking behind the design of my current railroad. This week I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in some of the aspects of layout design that are often overlooked. Now, although most of this has very little to do with the track plan of a layout, there's still things that are important to consider when designing a railroad before the first stick of wood is cut.
Well, just to refresh your memories, here is the layout design. And I've brought up this plan. It's not quite the same one that I showed you last week, but I wanted to show the comparison between the benchwork in this corner behind the door before and after I moved it. So originally the door was only 3 inches from the corner, meaning that I could get one spur right down like this, and that's all I was able to do. As soon as I moved the door, I was able to get a lot more industry in this area. There's 4 more industrial spurs that I did not have room for the first time round. And moving a door like this is not particularly difficult. Frankly, if you have the ability to build the benchwork for your layout, you have the ability to move the door. The only thing that might get a little bit awkward is the electrics. Unless you know what you're doing with electricity, then have a professional electrician move the light switches for you. Also, notice how I have the minimum 3-foot aisles. I mentioned that last week, but I think it's important enough to mention it again. Don't skimp on your aisle width. It's something you will probably regret. So let me now bring up a different drawing. I want to demonstrate certain other aspects of the layout design that are not normally shown in track plans. Here is the same layout again. You'll notice on this side of the plan the positions of the wall studs have been marked. That was necessary because of the complexity of the benchwork over this side. I needed to know where I could support the layout. When I built the left side of the layout first, that was not an issue because the structure could basically go anywhere I wanted it to. Let's have a look at a different version. It shows all the subterranean stuff. I've drawn all the workbenches and shelving, cabinets and such like, and certain aspects of the supporting structure. This area that I've now outlined is my workbench under the layout, and in order to give me maximum head clearance, I needed to make sure that the benchwork below it was as thin as possible. And of course the benchwork also had to have integral lighting. Now these yellow rectangles show the positions of strip lamps. The 2-footer I eventually turned around 90 degrees and I lined it up with this one using a shorter bracket. These dark grey strips here represent the 19-inch shelf brackets that I support the layout on. Where the strip lamps went in front of them, I had to use a slightly shorter length. The next length down is 14 inches, and that worked. But I still have the 19 inches at the ends of the sections where they're most critical. The peninsula section is sitting on a cabinet which I already had from my previous layout. I'll show you when I get downstairs. There are 3 plastic drawer packs built into an MDF cabinet. Very useful for storage. And then along the middle of the peninsula I have this single sheet of 3/4 inch MDF with a 2x4 stiffener at each end, and the inside edge of the peninsula rests on that, so that I'm not adding extra weight to the ends of these shelf brackets where the benchwork is already 30 inches wide, so it's already well off the end of them. I didn't want to strain them any further than necessary. This piece of MDF also supports a drawer pack which is hung off it. This blue outline here now. It's another cabinet that I had salvaged from my previous layout, bits above the workbench. And then I filled the rest of it with a narrow shelf along the back, very useful. And then at the end I had 2 more mini drawer packs which stand either side of this bracket. I later added one in this area here as well. And then this U-shaped area here, that cabinet was built with the intention of adding a spray booth into it, which, being in front of the window, means it's easy to vent just by adding a 4-inch infill panel down the end of the window with a pipe running through it. And also it supports the middle of the scenic section in front of the door. I knew that would be a heavy section because it's where most of my plaster mountains are, and I wasn't in a position to be able to put additional brackets in the middle. There's just one at each end. so I felt more comfortable adding a cabinet there. Also shown in this drawing are 3 storage units that I bought specifically to go in this location. There they are, 1, 2, 3. They are 18 inches by 3 feet and they fit under the layout. And then over this side, it's just left open to be able to store boxes of stuff. Although I never got round to it on this layout, I did make provision for curtains underneath the benchwork. Some areas wouldn't have had them because of the storage, but around here by the door, there's a gap here where the end of the curtain could have tucked in around the front of these shelving units and then tuck in again around there by the door. And along this edge as well, all the way to the spray booth, would have also been a curtained location. So the layout room looks neat as we walk in through the door. This cabinet here, I painted it the same colour as the fascia, so it wouldn't have drawn attention to itself. And then obviously the workbench has to be open. But by the time you get around here, you've already made your first impressions on the appearance of the room. So that's why I felt that just the 2 areas that could be seen from the front door would be curtained off. Okay, so that's all under the layout. Let's move on now to what's over the layout. Above the layout I have a lighting valance and shelf. It follows the benchwork edge very closely all the way around. These yellow rectangles show the strip lamp positions that I added for this section. The ones that were already in place for the first section are just shown in white. Now also demonstrated here is the awkwardness of these 4-foot fixtures. I used a few 2-footers where I had to, but they're more expensive, especially when it comes to buying the bulbs, because you have to buy the bulbs one at a time instead of in bulk packs, and the initial unit is more expensive as well. I guess it's because they sell fewer of them. If I was doing this layout design today, I would certainly be looking at LED rope lights instead of fluorescent lamps. The price of this lighting has come down dramatically in the last few years, and I think we're now at the point where it's actually cheaper. It's certainly cheaper on the electricity bill, and a lot more convenient. They are thinner, less cumbersome, a lot lighter. Anyway, again on this plan we show positions of the support brackets, and you can see I don't put them on every stud. About every other stud is sufficient, although in the case of the lighting valance I wanted to make sure they were in the same places as I needed them for the benchwork, because they're hung off the same vertical wall tracks. Also at this point I worked out the cutting pattern for the 7/16 OSB that I used for the upper shelf, and I'll show you that when I get downstairs. Very useful to get as much storage space as you possibly can, because I have for the most part used every bit of it. So let's head downstairs and take a look at some of these things in full-size 3D.
Well, here we are entering the train room again. Notice how we have plenty of space to walk, not like some layouts that I've operated on where the aisles are way too narrow. Okay. So I moved the door. Originally the trim was right in the very corner of the room. It didn't take very long to move it. The biggest job was fixing the drywall on the outside. So originally the drywall used to end here, and by taping that and then just floating out all the way to the corner, I was able to come out with a perfect job. Now, drywall is one of the tasks that I don't particularly enjoy. I'm not that good at it. I can fake it. It just takes me a lot longer than it does a dedicated drywaller. It's one of those things where I didn't particularly want to do it enough to get good at it. Now, the same day that I moved the door, I also added these switches. These 2 used to be right over here. Obviously they have to move with the door, and those were done just by leaving the wires dangling until I could incorporate them. I didn't have to cut or redo any wires at all. The same with the outlet, which is down here. It was in the middle of what is now the door opening, but again that was moved without touching the wires at all. And then I added a spur from this outlet to feed these 4 switches here. Each of these switches feeds one of these switched outlets. Now this gap in the middle is where there is a stud, so by putting 2 of them each side of the stud, I was able to use the opening for this one as a hand access while I was wiring up this one. I did these outlets and the switches outside without having to do any more drywall touch-up. But as I mentioned earlier, if you're not proficient with electrics, then get a professional to do it for you. It's one area where a mistake can be very costly. Being a general contractor for 13 years, I've been around all the trades for long enough to know what I'm doing. Now with these switch outlets, you'll see that everything that's plugged into it is a regular power cord. And I've used a different colour cord for each circuit. The green and the orange are the 2 zones of layout lighting. I split that into 2 zones, not because there's any great electrical load on it, but because it allows me to just have one side of the layout lit. I don't have to burn all the lights together if I'm just working over one side of the room. And then the 3rd switch is the workbench power, and the last one is the layout power. And these are just regular power cords that I buy and then cut to length. You'll notice some of them have aftermarket replacement plugs on the end, whereas the other 4 are still the original molded in plugs. So everything in the room can be switched off as I enter, just by hitting all the switches as I walk out. Looking under the layout now, here is one of the shelf brackets that supports the benchwork. This is one of the 19-inch brackets, the longest available in this particular range. It hangs from these heavy-duty vertical tracks. They are the double ones. Don't get the singles. The doubles are about 4 times as strong for marginally more money. Now you notice that I had to put a shim in here. That is because these brackets are designed to slope up slightly towards the outer edge to compensate for any sagging if they get overloaded. But I didn't want the slope. I needed to get the benchwork exactly level, so I had to put a shim in the back. And I found the angle of slope was about the same as the angle of a standard door shim, so very easy to deal with that. Depending on the location in the room, I use several different lengths of these tracks. This is a 4-footer, as are all of those on this side of the layout, and we can see up the top the same tracks support another row of brackets for the lighting valance. Now the lighting valance incorporates the MDF shelf and is built on a framework of 2x2s. Well, actually I bought 2x4s and ripped them down the middle. It's the cheapest way of getting lumber of about that size. And then the strip lamps are towards the front edge. The front member is a full 2x4, and for this location I bought 14 footers and I got them into the room through the open window because they wouldn't go through the door that way. And then the front of the lighting valance is a 10-inch deep strip of masonite, painted the same colour as the fascia. Over the other side of the layout, most of the wall tracks are the 6-foot tracks. That is because in addition to the lighting valance and the railroad, I also have the shelf and my workbench hung off the same tracks. So many of these have 4 separate brackets on them. And here we can see under the layout, I'm using the same lighting fixtures to light the workbench area as I do to light the layout. I also use the same bulbs that I use on the layout, so that with any luck the colour balance is the same. And there's another switch under here. The workbench lighting is on the same circuit as the workbench power. I have outlets, one up here, two along the back wall, and then two in that mess under there, which I've never used because this side of the workbench has always been a junk store. Here is the cabinet that I told you about that would eventually become a spray booth. This beam under here is a little unfortunate. It was necessary for the structure of this section. I had to drop the frame to allow clearance for the river under the two bridges. And I didn't want to risk weakening it too much. So structurally, this section here is somewhat similar to a depressed centre flat car with the fish belly side sills. And then the extractor fan for the spray booth would have occupied the area where the freight car boxes are at the moment in the window ledge, instead of taking up room space. And that is just an extension of the desk that I built that runs all the way around here. I did a video some time ago showing how I built this workbench and what I used to build it from. Now here is that other cabinet that I told you about upstairs, the one that supports the end of the peninsula. It is built to take 3 packs of these plastic drawers. I found them at Costco decades ago for use on my previous layout. I don't know if they're still available. I don't have a Costco near me anymore, but I think Walmart has a very similar one. And if I get back far enough, you can see the full height of it. And then these are very useful. It's plastic garage shelving. I bought 2 5-shelf units and I made 3 3-shelf units out of them with 1 shelf left over. And in this side, all these grey drawers. Some of them are out at the moment, but that was the other cabinet that was built under my previous layout, and it just hangs off that MDF panel that I told you about, the one that supports the benchwork for the peninsula. So the whole layout, although there is relatively little visible support, it's about as stable as the house. You can see how much stuff is stored under the layout. This room is quite full. And again, on the top shelf, very useful for lightweight stuff. Most scenery supplies are fairly light. I also got Christmas decorations and all sorts of stuff up there. Now, because the area over the top of the workbench is the most complex on the layout, and also being a harbour town, I have very limited fascia depth. I didn't have enough space to mount all the controls in the fascia. Let's pan around to the other side of the room quickly. Notice how on this side all my turnout controls are built into the front of the fascia. It's very convenient. Everything's also recessed so I can't snag clothing or anything on it as I walk by. But as I said, I didn't have that luxury over this side of the room. I wasn't able to drop the fascia without eliminating the headroom that I need for the workbench. So I have to have a control panel somewhere. You may have noticed earlier there was a small control panel behind the door, but the main one is under here. Let me put this down on the tripod, right in the middle of the frame now. Here is the control panel sitting in a pocket in the depth of the benchwork. These wires are long enough for me to move it to the front of the layout. They're fairly well back in my work area, so they're not in my way. They can be a little bit cumbersome when I'm reaching for stuff on the shelf, but that doesn't happen very often. So the control panel can just come out of here and then it hangs on the front edge of the layout during operating sessions. And there it is, put back out of the way. Only takes a couple of seconds to move it. Well, that's all for this week. This concludes this two-part mini-series. I hope it was both entertaining and useful. If you learned something from this video, then my goal will have been achieved. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next week. Bye for now.